For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3364.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3364, a bill to provide congressional review into counter-aggression by the governments of Iran, the Russian Federation, and North Korea, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include any extraneous material for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. Now, this bill represents a very broad bipartisan House-Senate agreement that the United States must enforce tougher sanctions against North Korea, against Russia, against Iran. And I want to thank the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Elliott Engel of New York, for his determined and excellent work on this legislation. This is a very important bill. These 3 regimes in different parts of the world are threatening vital U.S. interests, and they are destabilizing their neighbors. It is well past time that we forcefully respond. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia has invaded its neighbor, Ukraine, seizing its territory and destabilizing its government. It poses a threat to our NATO allies in Europe as Moscow works to undermine democratic values with determination and sophistication. As U.S. intelligence agencies have made clear, this former KGB colonel attempted to interfere with our own election. Left unchecked, Russia is sure to continue its aggression. Putin's forces continue to prop up the murderous Assad regime in Syria, prolonging a deadly conflict that has driven tens of millions of people from their homes while enabling the use of chemical weapons and other systematic human rights abuses against the people of Syria. The Russia sanctions in this bill are substantially similar to those that overwhelmingly passed the other body. They give the administration important economic leverage. They give it diplomatic leverage by targeting the things that matter to Vladimir Putin and that matter to his allies the most. And that is their corrupt efforts to profit from the country's oil wealth and their ability to sell weapons overseas. To focus their impact, we clarified several provisions that could have inadvertently handed Russian companies control of global energy projects and impacted pipelines that our European allies rely on in an effort to end their dependence on Russian gas. So this strengthens the bill to ensure these economic sanctions remain in place as long as Putin's aggression continues. This bill empowers Congress to review and to disapprove any sanctions relief. This strong oversight is necessary. It is appropriate. After all, it is Congress that the Constitution empowers to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Mr. Speaker, Russia has found a willing partner in Iran. The regime's Iranian Revolutionary Guards are fighting alongside Russian forces in Syria. At the same time, Tehran continues to threaten Israel by providing funding and advanced rockets and missiles to Hezbollah. Hezbollah is its leading terrorist proxy. It continues to hold Americans hostage while developing intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons. To strengthen the U.S. response to the threat from Iran, this bill includes provisions originally introduced by my counterpart, Senator Corker, which increase sanctions on those involved in the regime's human rights abuses and its support for terrorism, as well as its efforts on the ballistic missile program, which the Iranian Revolutionary Guards forces control. And finally, I am proud that this bill includes the text of H.R. 1644. This is the Korean Interdiction and Modernization of Sanctions Act. which we passed in May. We passed it here out of the House by a vote of 419 to 1. These provisions, which were strengthened in consultation with the other body, expand sanctions targeting North Korea's nuclear weapons program, but they also go after those around the world who employ North Korean slave labor. This is a human rights abuse. It's one that operates by having a situation where the indentured workers are fed, but the check, instead of going to the workers, goes to the regime. And that money then goes into the nuclear weapons program. It is estimated that this earns hundreds of millions of dollars for the regime in hard currency. So with every test, Kim Jong-un's regime comes closer to being able to mount a nuclear warhead on a missile that is capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. We simply cannot pass up an opportunity to increase pressure in response to this threat. And, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this legislation, and I yield myself as much time as I might consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I want to first of all thank colleagues on both sides of the aisle for all the hard work that's gone into this legislation so far. I want to especially thank our chairman, Ed Royce, who's been my partner on this committee for nearly 5 years. We have passed excellent legislation. The legislation today just adds to it, and it shows what you can do when you work in a bipartisan way. So I want to thank the chairman for all his hard work and all his courtesies. I support this bill. I certainly plan to vote for it. But it seems we may be on the floor before we ironed out all the differences with the other body. I hope that's not the case. In particular, there have been issues with the North Korea sanctions, which already passed in the House. It was another Royce-Engel bill, and frankly should have been taken up by the other body on a separate track. Instead, it's now put into this body. I hope we don't face further delays when this bill gets back to the other House. Our job isn't done, obviously, until we get this thing across the finish line. And we need to do that because this bill is critical to our national security. It does far more than just send a message to leaders in Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It exacts a heavy price for their aggressive and destabilizing behavior. Just like the bill we already passed, this legislation would update and expand our sanctions on North Korea, closing loopholes that have allowed money to flow to the Kim regime, funding its illegal weapons program. It would crack down on the trading partners, banks, and shipping vessels that enable the regime and go after the regime's most lucrative enterprises, whether exported goods or the pilfered wages of North Korean laborers sent abroad to work. With respect to Iran, this bill would go after so many of the things Iran's leaders do to drive violence and instability, from Tehran's ballistic missile program and its support for terrorism, to the regime's abhorrent human rights record and efforts to build up its military. I've said this again and again, that we need to hold the regime's feet to the fire on all these issues. This bill does exactly that. And finally, on Russia, this bill is a strong, direct response to Vladimir Putin's efforts to undermine American democracy. It imposes new sanctions on those who want to do business with Putin's cronies or with Russia's military or intelligence. It strengthens existing sanctions for Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and armed intervention in eastern Ukraine. It pushes back against Russia's cyber crimes, including a hacking of our election to help Donald Trump, a story which Congress and the special counsel are still trying to get to the bottom of, as well as Putin's support for the murderous Assad regime in Syria. And it gives the Congress a strong oversight role in making sure that these Russian sanctions are not lifted prematurely. This administration has shown over and over that they're willing to cozy up to Putin. But here's the truth. Russia is not our ally. Putin wants to harm the United States, splinter our alliances, and undermine Western democracy. This Congress will not allow him to succeed. So I'm glad to support this bipartisan bill. I thank the chairman once again. We need to keep working to make sure this bill gets to the President's desk, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
Yes, in recognizing the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Mike McCall, I just want to thank him for his good work to strengthen the bill, as he will discuss, and for his focus on pipelines that primarily carry oil and gas through Russia that compete with Russian gas and drives down the price of gas. With that, I yield Mr. McCall 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of increased sanctions on Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Elliott Engel for their leadership on this issue. I cannot overstate the importance of sending a strong message to our adversaries that there will be consequences for their bad behavior. Back in October of last year, at the height of the presidential campaign, I was briefed by our intelligence community. They told me that Russia engaged in a blatant effort to meddle in our domestic affairs and specifically our democratic process. I was an outspoken supporter of the need for a strong response then, and I remain so now. However, in the process of making Russia pay an economic cost for their bad behavior, we must ensure we are not harming U.S. interests at home and abroad. I want to thank Chairman Royce for clarifying that Section 232 of this bill only applies to Russian energy export pipelines. We should not be in the business of sanctioning pipelines that help provide energy independence from Russia. Putin uses this as a tool to provide political leverage over his neighbors. So again, I want to thank Chairman Royce for his leadership and working with me on this, I think, clarification to the Senate companion, and his leadership in the House on this important issue. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to my colleague on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 3364, the Russia, Iran, and North Korea Sanctions Act. And I thank my colleagues, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for all of their work together with the Senate to reach this important agreement. This legislation will ensure that Russia, Iran, and North Korea and those who seek to help them will suffer consequences for their bad behavior. In passage of this legislation is important to hold Iran accountable for its support for terrorism, human rights violations, and continued defiance of international treaties, including on ballistic missiles. Today, we're taking an important step towards holding the Iranian government, including the IRGC, and anyone who seeks to support them accountable for their bad actions. Anyone who contributes to Iran's ballistic missile program, supplies it with weapons, or assists the Iranian government in their vast human rights abuses will be subject to sanctions. It's important to note that these sanctions do not violate the JCPOA and, in my view, strengthen the nuclear deal by showing our allies in Iran that the United States is serious about continuing to enforce violations of international law. I'm also pleased to see additional sanctions imposed upon Russia and North Korea in this legislation. The human suffering that North Korea has brought upon its own people is unimaginable. Such a depraved leader as Kim Jong-un getting his hands on nuclear weapons that can be used against America and our allies is an outcome that we simply cannot tolerate. Finally, Russia engaged in an unprecedented attack against our democracy when it interfered in our 2016 elections. This is the fundamental foundation of our democracy, our elections, and we simply cannot allow any foreign power to interfere in our electoral process. Given our president's complete unwillingness to hold Russia accountable for their attack, and let's not mistake it for anything else, it was an attack on America. It has become necessary for Congress to assert its role in this area and ensure that Russia will be held accountable. So again, I thank Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, Leader Pelosi, Whip Hoyer, and members of the Senate who worked together to get this bill to the floor, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith. He's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, global health, global human rights, and international organizations.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
And thank him for sponsoring and Elliott Engel this important bill. This bill brings together a critical arsenal of stiff and timely sanctions against Iran, Russia, and North Korea. The administration was absolutely right in early February to put Iran on notice regarding its continued testing of ballistic missiles. This bill underscores that warning by imposing expanded sanctions against Iran's missile program, demonstrating that the United States will not sit idly by as Iran augments its ability to militarily blackmail the United States, Israel, and our allies. It also, as the world's largest sponsor of terrorism, imposes terror sanctions on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It, very importantly as well, authorizes the imposition of sanctions on individuals responsible for Iran's human rights abuses. The State Department suggests there are as many as 800 political prisoners in Iran alone. It also reminds us and draws attention to Iran's despicable practice of arresting American citizens to use them as bargaining chips. On Russia, Mr. Speaker, the Putin government's invasion of the Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, indiscriminate bombing of Syria, and threatening behavior toward our NATO allies, above all in the Baltics, makes it, in important respects, the worst actor in the global states today. Putin's government has passed from threats to aggressive actions against our friends, allies, and innocent people abroad. Let's not forget that in 2008, and I was there in Tbilisi as it was happening, the Russians invaded Georgia and annexed South Ossetia and Abkhazia. As to North Korea, a gulag masquerading as a country, we must cut off all economic lifelines to Kim Jong-un and punish Pyongyang's clients and its enablers. A regime that murders Otto Warmbier and then, of course, is working on more missiles and the means to deliver them needs to be taken seriously. This legislation does that with very, very stiff sanctions. I want to thank again Chairman Royce, Elliot Engel, also the Majority Leader McCarthy, and Steny Hoyer as the principal sponsors of the bill. Yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to our colleague on the Foreign Affairs Committee and member of the Intelligence Committee, gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Gentleman from Texas, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. And thank you, Ranking Member Engel, for yielding. And I want to thank also Chairman Royce for your leadership on this sanctions package. The American people have been waiting some time for this sanctions package to finally pass. This bill dials up our current sanctions on North Korea, Iran, and Russia to hold their governments accountable for their destabilizing actions. The Russia piece in this package is particularly necessary. Russia has flagrantly violated international law by invading Ukraine and interfering in American and European elections. These sanctions are a clear signal that the United States will hold President Putin and his close associates accountable for their actions. They are also a declaration that Congress can and will act even when President Trump refuses to do so. In addition to these sanctions, Congress must continue to investigate to determine the scope of Russia's attack on America's democracy and establish which Americans, if any, aided in those efforts. Again, thank you to Ranking Member Engel, Chairman Royce, and everyone in this Congress who has supported these sanctions. I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Henseling, Chairman of the Committee on Financial Services.
Gentleman from Texas, recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and certainly thank him for his leadership on this very important bill. So I rise in support of the Russia, Iran, and North Korean Sanctions Act. And Mr. Speaker, I particularly want to highlight the provisions that are the product of the hard work of the Financial Services Committee's Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance. The inclusion of these provisions will undoubtedly assist our government's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing efforts. For instance, this bill includes language directing the President, acting through the Secretary of Treasury, to develop and maintain a national strategy for combating the financing of terrorism and related forms of illicit finance. The opportunistic nature of terrorist groups combined with the emergence of financial technology creates new challenges for our law enforcement community and their efforts to disrupt terror finance. A national strategy should also seek to enhance partnerships with the private sector that prevent and detect illicit financing and increase efforts to facilitate compliance with our anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing laws. I'd like to commend Congressman Ted Budd for introducing the National Strategy for Combating Terrorist, Underground, and Other Illicit Financing Act, which is almost entirely incorporated into the Section 2 of the underlying legislation. I'd also like to recognize Congressman Pierce and Congressman Pittenger, the chairman and vice chairman of the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee of our committee, whose leadership on these issues has been instrumental to achieve the legislation that is before us today. We know, Mr. Speaker, that Thomas Jefferson once famously said, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." And that is indeed true, thanks in no small part to the hard work of the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance. The bill before us today ensures that we remain vigilant to address the evolving threats to our financial system, and I am proud to support it and encourage all members to support it. And again, I want to thank Chairman Royce for his leadership today on this bill and in our committee, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 3 minutes to a gentleman who was instrumental in putting this bill forward, who has been with us every step of the way and so invaluable to this finished product. That's the distinguished Democratic whip, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, and I yield him 3 minutes.
The distinguished whip is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen. I thank the ranking member for yielding, Mr. Engel, and I thank Mr. Royce. I have said this before, I will say it again. Mr. Royce as chairman and Mr. Engel as ranking member are an example for, frankly, all of us of how to work together productively in a bipartisan fashion to reach a result that is good for our country, for our people, and indeed for international security. I also want to thank Senators Cardin and Corker for their leadership and their involvement. This legislation is the product of very careful and sometimes difficult negotiations on a bipartisan basis. It is strong, tough, and appropriate response to Russia's attempts to meddle in our election process, its support for violent separatists in Ukraine, its illegal occupation of Crimea, and yes, its unhelpful activity in Syria. It also imposes new sanctions on Iran's ballistic missile program, which threatens the United States, our Gulf allies, and Israel. Russia's power comes from its ability to coerce other nations by its energy distribution in many instances. This bill seeks to make it harder for Russia to use that type of coercion and empower other nations to join us in standing up against Russian aggression. These sanctions will only be successful, however, if they are truly bipartisan and if Congress continues to play its important and necessary oversight role. Democrats and Republicans are coming together on this bill, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the President cannot alter sanctions toward Russia without congressional review. This is critical at a moment when our allies are uncertain about where this administration stands with respect to Russian aggression. I remain open to additional sanctions on Russia's energy sector at a later date if the Russian leader and his associates fail to heed the message of this bill that their business as usual cannot and must not continue. Once this bill passes the Senate, as I believe it will, Russia will know that sanctions levied because of its malevolent acts will be lifted only with the concurrence, either tacitly or expressly, of the Congress of the United States. There'll be no side deals or turning a blind eye to its actions. This legislation, Mr. Speaker, will also make it clear that Russia's interference in Ukraine comes with consequences, and it puts pressure on Iran to end its ballistic missile program. In addition, it deters, hopefully, North Korea from pursuing its dangerous development of nuclear weapons and vehicles to deliver those weapons as close as the western part of this country. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and send it to the Senate as quickly as possible and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York, or gentleman from California, excuse me.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to recognize the good work of the Democratic whip, Mr. Steny Hoyer, and also the Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, on this legislation, and thank them.
If the gentleman will yield, frankly, all four of us, yourself, your leadership, Mr. Engel, the majority leader, and I were privileged to work together in a way that, as I said at the beginning, was constructive and I think has resulted in a very good product. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pete Sessions. He's the chairman of the Rules Committee for the purpose of a colloquy.
I want to thank the chairman for yielding and rise to applaud him for the hard work and the responsible actions that the chairman has taken, not only to ensure this piece of legislation is prepared, but bettered and ready to go back to the Senate. I think we have a forcible sanctions bill that is before the House today, and one that targets not only Iran and Russia, but also the North Korean regime. As you know, the bill that was passed by the Senate risked giving Russian energy firms a competitive advantage across the globe by inadvertently denying American companies access to neutral third-party energy markets where there would simply be a small or de minimis Russian presence. The bill before us today prevents Russia from being able to weaponize these sanctions against U.S. energy firms, and I want to thank Chairman Royce for his hard work on this issue. I also want to ensure that we have an understanding of the definition of the word controlling in Section 223D of H.R. 3364. For purposes of clarification and legislative intent, the term controlling means the power to direct, determine, or resolve fundamental operational and financial decisions of an oil project through the ownership of a majority of the voting interest of the oil project. And I would ask the gentleman, the young chairman, if he agrees with that definition.
Yes, that is my understanding.
Well, I want to thank you for not only this clarification, but making sure that we are most specific in what we are undertaking. I'd also like to note that the Shah Deniz pipeline and the Southern Gas Corridor projects will continue to be able to bring gas from the Caspian Sea, which is a huge find, to our European allies, reducing their dependency on Russian energy.
That is my understanding.
I want to thank the gentleman, and I would thank him for his time on this colloquy.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1.5 minutes to one of my senior colleagues on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the ranking member of the Terrorism Subcommittee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in strong support of this bill, which is really a combination of 3 bills. First, as to North Korea, it embodies a bill passed on this floor last month, introduced by Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, Mr. Yoho, and myself from the Asia Subcommittee. We will expand our sanctions on North Korea's precious metals, minerals, jet fuel, coal, and across the board, and especially banking sanctions. But keep in mind, ultimately, we have got to force China to decide whether they're going to support North Korea or whether they're going to have access to American markets. We can't let them have both. As to Iran, this bill designates the entire Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, as the Quds Force has already been designated, as subject to terrorism sanctions, provides an arms embargo, and let us remember that the real face of this regime in Tehran is not their dapper foreign minister, but rather it is the hundreds of thousands who have died in Syria as a result of Iranian action. Speaking of countries that have supported Assad, finally and perhaps most importantly, this bill provides sanctions against Russia, necessary because of its actions in the Ukraine and its interference in our elections. We hit Russia in a very important way by dealing with the technology they would need to exploit oil. Unfortunately, even under this very strong bill, it would take a 2/3 vote for us to block a sanctions waiver should our resolution be vetoed. I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
Yes, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Judge Poe, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman and also thank the ranking member for their work on this legislation. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken to our military leaders, and they said that the biggest threat to the United States is North Korea. Strategic patience is over. It's time for strategic sanctions. This bill will go a long way to tighten the screws on Little Kim and bring the dictator to his knees. We can no longer stand by meekly while North Korea terrorizes the world. This bill includes my bill that has already passed the House that calls on the State Department to reassess if North Korea should be on the state sponsor of terrorism list. Let us not forget that North Korea helped supply Syria with chemical weapons. It has given Iran ballistic missiles and advice on how to develop its own nukes. North Korea and Iran's evil cooperation is even going on as we speak today. They are now working together to develop an intercontinental ballistic missile that can reach American shores. This bill also puts China in the crosshairs. Chinese banks have enabled the Korean regime to avoid sanctions and build its illegal weapons programs. China even provided the vehicle used to launch the North Koreans' new ICBM. China also uses slave labor from North Korea to help North Korea avoid sanctions already in place. China needs to understand how its support for Kim will not only endanger the United States and South Korea, but it also endangers its own security. By targeting these rogue nations, we show we will not go away quietly in the darkness of silence. And that's just the way it is. I'll yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to one of our senior members on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend, the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Engel. Mr. Speaker, today, this House comes together on a bipartisan basis to address sanctions and the rules undergirding sanctions for North Korea, Iran, and most importantly, perhaps, Russia. Importantly, because there's been a lot of doubt about whether this Congress would ever again speak eloquently and forcefully about Russian behavior. Today, we answer that question. Overwhelmingly, we say Russia's behavior is unacceptable in many, many ways, not least of which is the incursion of sovereign territory of its neighbors, specifically Georgia, Ukraine, including the Crimea. I vote easily and enthusiastically for this resolution today, but it must not be construed because it references the Minsk agreements that means we don't mean to continue sanctions on the Crimean invasion. We do. And Mr. Shabbat and I know the chairman and ranking member of our committee, will continue to be vigilant on that until that illegal annexation is ended. I commend the leadership for bringing this resolution to the floor, and I am proud today to be a member of this body and speaking with one voice about Russian behavior and the need for sanctioning it. I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance, a member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of this sanctions bill. The governments of Iran, North Korea, and Russia do not share American values or interests and are active threats to our national security. These regimes will see a united message from the Congress of the United States with an overwhelming vote in favor of strong sanctions. Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. North Korea, the most dangerous and isolated place on Earth, has tested long-range missiles, demonstrating a frightening potential to target our West Coast. And Russia has intolerably involved itself in our nation's democratic electoral process. Its invasion of Crimea and actions in the Ukraine are totally unacceptable. Let us act decisively today and put these states on notice, violate international law by threatening the United States, and thereby face the consequences. I urge a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I thank Ranking Member Engel for his leadership and for the time. And I thank the Chairman Royce for his leadership and the way that he's worked with our side of the aisle. I rise in support of the Russia, Iran, and North Korea Sanctions Act, legislation that is desperately needed to prevent this administration from rolling back sanctions tied to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and interference in our election. This bill's enhanced sanctions on Russia are important in light of the actions of Russian President Vladimir Putin, not to mention the many ties between the Trump administration and the Kremlin. In a recent development, the Treasury Department confirmed that ExxonMobil violated existing Russian sanctions while under the leadership of Rex Tillerson, who is now Donald Trump's Secretary of State. Indeed, in 2014, Exxon signed documents related to oil and gas projects in Russia with Igor Sanctions, the president of Rosneft, a Russian state-owned oil giant. Sanctions was one of the individuals subject to sanctions. Exxon was fined a mere $2 million, a slap on the wrist for a company that earned $7.8 billion in profits in 2016. Russia is continuing its aggression in Ukraine. It is supporting the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and it interfered in the 2016 U.S. election. That is why we must strengthen the sanctions against Russia, and we must block Rex Tillerson and Donald Trump from waiving or lifting those sanctions without review. Before closing, I would also note that the legislation before us also includes several measures championed by Democrats on the Financial Services Committee. These provisions will focus the government on creating a national strategy to combat the financing of terrorism, enhance Treasury's tools for combating money laundering, vulnerabilities such as the well-known risk in high-end real estate, and help address the growing de-risking trend that is driving fund transfers into the shadows and cutting off remittances for vulnerable populations. I thank you so very much, and I yield back.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, a member of the Committee on Financial Services.
From North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 3364. In particular, I am proud of the bipartisan language in the bill, which would create a national strategy for combating terrorism and illicit finance. The financing of terrorism and related forms of illicit finance present a direct threat to our national security and financial system. So it is critical for the government to create and maintain a unified strategy to fight financial crime, both to accommodate new and developing threats and to help Congress develop legislative and funding priorities now and in the future. Additionally, a national strategy should seek to enhance intergovernmental cooperation and to identify illicit financing trends and to encourage federal agencies to work with the private financial sector to do the same. Mr. Speaker, this bill does these things and will go a long way in making sure we are keeping pace with the ever-changing terror finance landscape. I'd like to thank Chairman Hensarling for his extraordinary conservative leadership on the Financial Services Committee and for helping to include this language in the overall bill. Additionally, I want to thank the chairman of the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Subcommittee, Mr. Pierce, and for his support, and for my colleague, Ms. Sinema, for her work on this as well. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you. No sooner said than done. It's my pleasure to yield 1 minute to my friend on the Financial Services Committee, the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Sinema.
Gentlelady from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise today in support of H.R. 3364. The authoritarian regimes in Iran, Russia, and North Korea continue to undermine global peace and security and threaten the safety of the United States and our allies. Russia's coordinated efforts to undermine democracies and free and fair elections around the world is particularly troubling and demand a strong response. I thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for their bipartisan legislation that counters these belligerent regimes and ensures strong oversight by Congress and the American people. The safety and security of our communities and our country must come before partisanship. I also thank the Chair and Ranking Member for introducing our bipartisan legislation, introduced with Congressman Budd, to establish a whole-of-government strategy to combat the financing of terrorism. Current U.S. efforts to counter the financing of terrorism lack sufficient coordination, and the U.S. has no unified national strategy to guide our counter-financing efforts. Money is the lifeblood of any organization. We must establish a comprehensive and effective strategy to deny money to terrorists. This strategy will enhance detection, deterrence, and prosecution, and ultimately strengthen our broader national security goals. Again, I thank the Chair and Ranking Member for advancing this important bipartisan national security bill, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
I continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from New York. Gentleman from New York.
I'm sorry, it's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to my friend on the Appropriations Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Ryan.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for their leadership on this. This clearly is a big issue pressing the country, and I just wanted to rise in support of what's happening here today, of taking a firmer stance on Russia, Iran, and North Korea, trying to stabilize the peninsula, trying to take care of the funding that's coming out of Iran to all of these terrorist groups across the country and across the world, and just say that what's happening with these sanctions here and the targeting of Russian gas pipelines, their #1 export, I think, is entirely appropriate. The Nord Stream 2, which carries gas from Russia through the Baltics to Germany, and I know Germany isn't happy about it, but this is something that we have to do. And the point I want to make is we have to address this issue in a comprehensive way. We must continue to focus on how we get our gas here in the United States, our natural gas, to Europe, to our allies, so they're not so dependent on Russia. We got to have the sanctions, but we also got to be shipping liquid natural gas to some of these allies of ours so they're not so dependent on the Russians, which is part and parcel of this entire approach. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
I'll continue to reserve, Mr.
Gentleman
Speaker.
from New York.
Yes, it's now my pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Illinois, a respected member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Ms. Schakowsky.
Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in support of today's sanction legislation, which I'm so happy to find has complied with the Iran nuclear agreement, something I worked very hard on, as did many here. Experts, the international community, and even some of President Trump's own advisors agree that the Iran nuclear agreement is working. In June, the International Atomic Energy Agency certified that Iran is within the limits set by this historic deal. There are serious issues left to be addressed with Iran, especially in regards to human rights violations and ballistic missiles, which this bill covers. The Iran deal took Iran's nuclear weapons off the table, allowed us to deal with these remaining challenges. Withdrawing or violating the agreement would be an enormous mistake. This bill upholds our agreement with Iran while also holding Russia and North Korea accountable for their actions. I urge all my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
I'll continue to reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to stress two critical aspects of this legislation. First, it would impose tough sanctions on Russia for its serious international violations, the seizure of Crimea, its violent incursion into Ukraine, its cyber interference in the 2016 U.S. election. Perhaps most importantly, in the present context, it would prevent President Trump from removing or softening existing sanctions without congressional approval. Second, the bill addresses Iran's unacceptable behavior in the non-nuclear realm, such as ballistic missile development, human rights violations, financing of terrorism, without violating the nuclear deal with Iran. The JCPOA celebrated its second anniversary 2 weeks ago. It's given the international community 24/7 access to Iran's nuclear sites, provided an enforcement mechanism to ensure that Iran's nuclear-related activity is solely peaceful, and elongated Iran's breakout time to over a year. It has made the world a safer place. As the United States continues to monitor the JCPOA and Iran's behavior, it's important that Congress continue to refrain from actions that would violate the deal, threaten the deal, or impose careless sanctions that, under the guise of being tough on Iran, would make the
An additional 30 seconds.
Right. I thank the chairman. So as the United States continues to monitor the JCPOA and Iran's behavior, it's important that Congress continue to refrain from actions that would violate the deal, threaten the deal, or impose careless sanctions that, under the guise of being tough on Iran, would make the United States less safe. This legislation meets that test, and I urge its adoption. Now yield back.
Chair would inform the managers that the gentleman from California has 3.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from New York has 1 minute remaining. Gentleman from California.
I'll reserve the right to close, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from New York has 1 minute remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to speak quickly. On Vladimir Putin's orders, Russia attacked American democracy last year. This makes Russia a threat to this country, just like Iran, just like North Korea. And when the United States faces a real threat, we have an obligation to respond. So far, our response to Russia has fallen far short. That ends with this legislation. Along with Pyongyang and Tehran, Moscow needs to understand that if you violate international law, if you threaten the security of the United States and our allies, there will be consequences. Now, I wish we were going to pass this and send it to the President's desk today. So after we vote today, leaders in both houses have an obligation to clear away any remaining issues and get this bill signed into law as soon as possible. So long as Russia remains a threat, so long as Iran and North Korea defy global norms with their destructive agendas, none of us is off the hook. I want to also thank the Democratic leader, Ms. Pelosi, for her advice and counsel on this bill. Let's pass this bill and keep pressing this bill forward. I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, in closing, I'd like to again thank my colleagues, the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Engel, as well as our counterparts, Senator Corker and Cardin, the Majority Leader, Mr. McCarthy, and the Minority Whip, Mr. Hoyer, as well as the leadership on both sides of the aisle and the other body. They deserve credit for their effort. Let me also say it's critically important that we stand shoulder to shoulder with our European allies in countering Russian aggression. And that is why, in the bipartisan House-Senate negotiations, we secured important changes to improve transatlantic cooperation. And so I'm confident that under the text of the House, this House bill that will pass today, these concerns have been addressed. Let me also say that every time North Korea tests a ballistic missile or a nuclear device, it gets closer to having the ability to strike the U.S. mainland with a nuclear weapon. For years, the policies of successive administrations have failed to get North Korea to change. Why? Because diplomatic pressure has been applied only in spurts. It's been lifted prematurely for North Korean promises that have never materialized. So we need leverage, and leverage comes from real, sustained pressure. And that's why I've authored tough new sanctions to crack down on the regime, to shut off the regime's access to the hard currency it needs to fund its nuclear program, and we've included that in this bill. These sanctions passed in this House in May by a vote of 419 to 1, and it is time for the other body to pick them up. And by including these North Korean sanctions in the legislation, we ensure that our colleagues do so. We cannot afford any more delay, and that's why I worked with the other body to make small changes to the North Korean sanctions in this bill to ensure swift passage in both houses. I'm confident this bill, including the North Korean sanctions bill, will soon become law. And let me say that congressional engagement in foreign affairs is strongest when we all speak with one voice. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the bill and join us in sending a clear message to Vladimir Putin, to Kim Jong-un, and to the radical regime in Tehran that efforts to threaten the United States and to destabilize our allies will be met with a united American response. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3364? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, two-thirds of those being in the affirmative.
On that, I request the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those in support of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed.